Part Two, Combray, Section 11. But the day on which, while my father took counsel with his family upon our strange meeting with Legrandin, I went down to the kitchen, was one of those days when Giotto's Charity, still very weak and ill after her recent confinement, had been unable to rise from her bed. Françoise, being without assistance, had fallen into arrears. When I went in, I saw her in the back kitchen, which opened on to the courtyard, in process of killing a chicken. By its desperate and quite natural resistance, which Françoise, beside herself with rage, as she attempted to slit its throat beneath the ear, accompanied with shrill cries of "Filthy creature! Filthy creature!" it made the saintly kindness and unction of our servant rather less prominent than it would do next day at dinner, when it made its appearance in a skin gold embroidered like a chasuble, and its precious juice was poured out drop by drop as from a pyx. When it was dead, Françoise mopped up its streaming blood, in which, however, she did not let her rancor drown, for she gave vent to another burst of rage, and gazing down at the carcass of her enemy, uttered a final "Filthy creature!" I crept out of the kitchen and upstairs, trembling all over. I could have prayed then for the instant dismissal of Françoise. But who would have baked me such hot rolls, boiled me such fragrant coffee, and even roasted me such chickens? And as it happened, every one else had already had to make the same cowardly reckoning. For my Aunt Léonie knew, though I was still in ignorance of this, that Françoise, who for her own daughter or for her nephews would have given her life without a murmur, showed a singular implacability in her dealings with the rest of the world. In spite of which my aunt still retained her, for, while conscious of her cruelty, she could appreciate her services. I began gradually to realize that Françoise's kindness, her compunction, the sum total of her virtues, concealed many of these back kitchen tragedies, just as history reveals to us that the reigns of the kings and queens, who are portrayed as kneeling with clasped hands in the windows of churches, were stained by oppression and bloodshed. I had taken note of the fact that, apart from her own kinsfolk, the sufferings of humanity inspired in her a pity which increased in direct ratio to the distance separating the sufferers from herself. The tears which flowed from her in torrents when she read of the misfortunes of persons unknown to her in a newspaper were quickly stemmed once she had been able to form a more accurate mental picture of the victims. One night, shortly after her confinement, the kitchen maid was seized with the most appalling pains. Mamma heard her groans, and rose and awakened Françoise, who, quite unmoved, declared that all the outcry was mere malingering, that the girl wanted to play the mistress in the house. The doctor, who had been afraid of some such attack, had left a marker in a medical dictionary which we had, at the page on which the symptoms were described, and had told us to turn up this passage, where we would find the measures of first aid to be adopted. My mother sent Françoise to fetch the book, warning her not to let the marker drop out. An hour elapsed, and Françoise had not returned. My mother, supposing that she had gone back to bed, grew vexed, and told me to go myself to the bookcase and fetch the volume. I did so, and there found Françoise, who, in her curiosity to know what the marker indicated, had begun to read the clinical account of these after pains, and was violently sobbing, now that it was a question of a type of illness with which she was not familiar. At each painful symptom mentioned by the writer, she would exclaim, "Oh, oh, Holy Virgin! Is it possible that God wishes any wretched human creature to suffer so? Oh, the poor girl!" But when I had called her, and she had returned to the bedside of Giotto's Charity, her tears at once ceased to flow. She could find no stimulus for that pleasant sensation of tenderness and pity which she very well knew, having been moved to it often enough by the perusal of newspapers; nor any other pleasure of the same kind in her sense of weariness and irritation at being pulled out of bed in the middle of the night for the kitchen maid; so that at the sight of those very sufferings, the printed account of which had moved her to tears, she had nothing to offer but ill-tempered mutterings, mingled with bitter sarcasm, saying, when she thought that we had gone out of earshot, "Well, she need never have done what she must have done to bring all this about. She found that pleasant enough, I dare say. She had better not put on any airs now. All the same, he must have been a God forsaken young man to go after that. Dear, dear, it's just as they used to say in my poor mother's country, snaps and snails and puppy dogs' tails and dirty sluts in plenty smell sweeter than roses in young men's noses when the heart is 1 in 20. Although when her grandson had a slight cold in his head, she would set off at night, even if she were ill also, instead of going to bed, to see whether he had everything that he wanted, covering 10 miles on foot before daybreak so as to be in time to begin her work. This same love for her own people, and her desire to establish the future greatness of her house on a solid foundation reacted, in her policy with regard to the other servants, in one unvarying maxim, which was never to let any of them set foot in my aunt's room. Indeed, she showed a sort of pride in not allowing any one else to come near my aunt, preferring, when she herself was ill, to get out of bed and to administer the Vichy water in person, rather than to concede to the kitchen maid the right of entry into her mistress's presence. There is a species of hymenoptera, observed by Fabre, the burrowing wasp, which, in order to provide a supply of fresh meat for her offspring after her own decease, calls in the science of anatomy to amplify the resources of her instinctive cruelty, and having made a collection of weevils and spiders, proceeds with marvelous knowledge and skill to pierce the nerve centre on which their power of locomotion, but none of their other vital functions, depends, so that the paralyzed insect beside which her egg is laid will furnish the larva, when it is hatched, with a tamed and inoffensive quarry, incapable either of flight or of resistance, but perfectly fresh for the larder. In the same way Françoise had adopted, to minister to her permanent and unfaltering resolution to render the house uninhabitable to any other servant, a series of crafty and pitiless stratagems. Many years later we discovered that if we had been fed on asparagus day after day throughout that whole season, it was because the smell of the plants gave the poor kitchen maid, who had to prepare them, such violent attacks of asthma that she was finally obliged to leave my aunt's service. Alas, we had definitely to alter our opinion of Monsieur Legrandin. On one of the Sundays following our meeting with him on the Pont Vieux, after which my father had been forced to confess himself mistaken, as Mass drew to an end, and with the sunshine and the noise of the outer world, something else invaded the church, an atmosphere so far from sacred that Madame Goupil, Madame Persépi, all those, in fact, who a moment ago, when I arrived a little late, had been sitting motionless, their eyes fixed on their prayer books, who, I might even have thought, had not seen me come in, had not their feet moved slightly to push away the little kneeling desk which was preventing me from getting to my chair, began in loud voices to discuss with us all manner of utterly mundane topics, as though we were already outside in the square. We saw, standing on the sun-baked steps of the porch, dominating the many-colored tumult of the market, Legrandin himself, whom the husband of the lady we had seen with him on the previous occasion was just going to introduce to the wife of another large landed proprietor of the district. Legrandin's face showed an extraordinary zeal and animation. He made a profound bow, with a subsidiary backward movement which brought his spine sharply up into a position behind its starting point, a gesture in which he must have been trained by the husband of his sister, Madame de Combermere. This rapid recovery caused a sort of tense muscular wave to ripple over Legrandin's hips, which I had not supposed to be so fleshy, I cannot say why. But this undulation of pure matter, this wholly carnal fluency, with not the least hint in it of spiritual significance, this wave lashed to a fury by the wind of an assiduity, an obsequiousness of the basest sort, awoke my mind suddenly to the possibility of a Legrandin altogether different from the one whom we knew. The lady gave him some message for her coachman, and while he was stepping down to her carriage the impression of joy, timid and devout, which the introduction had stamped there still lingered on his face. Carried away in a sort of dream, he smiled, then he began to hurry back towards the lady. He was walking faster than usual, and his shoulders swayed backwards and forwards, right and left, in the most absurd fashion. Altogether he looked, so utterly had he abandoned himself to it, ignoring all other considerations, as though he were the lifeless and wire-pulled puppet of his own happiness. Meanwhile we were coming out through the porch. We were passing close beside him. He was too well bred to turn his head away, but he fixed his eyes, which had suddenly changed to those of a seer, lost in the profundity of his vision, on so distant a point of the horizon that he could not see us, and so had not to acknowledge our presence. His face emerged, still with an air of innocence, from his straight and pliant coat, which looked as though conscious of having been led astray, in spite of itself, and plunged into surroundings of a detested splendor. And a spotted necktie, stirred by the breezes of the Square, continued to float in front of Le Grandin, like the standard of his proud isolation, of his noble independence. Just as we reached the house, my mother discovered that we had forgotten the Saint Honoré, and asked my father to go back with me, and tell them to send it up at once. Near the church we met Le Grandin, coming towards us with the same lady, whom he was escorting to her carriage. He brushed past us, and did not interrupt what he was saying to her, but gave us, out of the corner of his blue eye, a little sign, which began and ended, so to speak, inside his eyelids, and as it did not involve the least movement of his facial muscles, managed to pass quite unperceived by the lady. But, striving to compensate by the intensity of his feelings for the somewhat restricted field in which they had to find expression, he made that blue chink, which was set apart for us, sparkle with all the animation of cordiality, which went far beyond mere playfulness, and almost touched the border line of roguery. He subtilized the refinements of good fellowship into a wink of connivance, a hint, a hidden meaning, a secret understanding, all the mysteries of complicity in a plot, and finally exalted his assurances of friendship to the level of protestations of affection, even of a declaration of love, lighting up for us, and for us alone, with a secret and languid flame invisible by the great lady upon his other side, an enamored pupil in a countenance of ice. Only the day before he had asked my parents to send me to dine with him on this same Sunday evening. "Come and bear your aged friend company," he had said to me, "like the nosegay which a traveler sends us from some land to which we shall never go again. Come and let me breathe from the far country of your adolescence the scent of those flowers of spring among which I also used to wander many years ago. Come with the primrose, with the canon's beard, with the gold cup. Come with the stonecrop, whereof are posies made, pledges of love in the Balzacian flora. Come with that flower of the resurrection morning, the Easter daisy. Come with the snowballs of the Guelder rose, which begin to embalm with their fragrance the alleys of your great aunt's garden ere the last snows of Lent are melted from its soil. Come with the glorious silken raiment of the lily, apparel fit for Solomon, and with the many-colored enamel of the pansies, but come, above all, with the spring breeze, still cooled by the last frosts of winter, wafting apart for the two butterflies' sake that have waited outside all morning, the closed portals of the first Jerusalem rose." The question was raised at home whether, all things considered, I ought still to be sent to dine with Monsieur Le Grandin. But my grandmother refused to believe that he could have been impolite. "You admit yourself that he appears at church there, quite simply dressed, and all that. He hardly looks like a man of fashion." She added that, in any event, even if at the worst he had been intentionally rude, it was far better for us to pretend that we had noticed nothing. And indeed my father himself, though more annoyed than any of us by the attitude which Le Grandin had adopted, may still have held in reserve a final uncertainty as to its true meaning. It was like every attitude or action which reveals a man's deep and hidden character. They bear no relation to what he has previously said, and we cannot confirm our suspicions by the culprit's evidence, for he will admit nothing. We are reduced to the evidence of our own senses, and we ask ourselves, in the face of this detached and incoherent fragment of recollection, whether indeed our senses have not been the victims of a hallucination, with the result that such attitudes, and these alone are of importance in indicating character, are the most apt to leave us in perplexity. I dined with Le Grandin on the terrace of his house by moonlight. "There is a charming quality, is there not," he said to me, "in this silence? For hearts that are wounded as mine is, a novelist, whom you will read in time to come, claims that there is no remedy but silence and shadow. And see you this, my boy, there comes in all lives a time, towards which you still have far to go, when the weary eyes can endure but one kind of light, the light which a fine evening like this prepares for us in the still room of darkness, when the ears can listen to no music save what the moonlight breathes through the flute of silence. I could hear what Monsieur Legrandin was saying. Like everything that he said, it sounded attractive. But I was disturbed by the memory of a lady whom I had seen recently for the first time, and thinking, now that I knew that Legrandin was on friendly terms with several of the local aristocracy, that perhaps she also was among his acquaintance, I summoned up all my courage and said to him, "Tell me, sir, do you by any chance know the lady, the ladies of Guermantes?" And I felt glad because in pronouncing the name I had secured a sort of power over it, by the mere act of drawing it up out of my dreams and giving it an objective existence in the world of spoken things. But at the sound of the word Guermantes, I saw in the middle of each of our friend's blue eyes a little brown dimple appear, as though they had been stabbed by some invisible pin point, while the rest of his pupils, reacting from the shock, received and secreted the azure overflow. His fringed eyelids darkened and drooped. His mouth, which had been stiffened and seared with bitter lines, was the first to recover, and smiled while his eyes still seemed full of pain, like the eyes of a good-looking martyr whose body bristles with arrows. "No, I do not know them," he said, but instead of uttering so simple a piece of information, a reply in which there was so little that could astonish me, in the natural and conversational tone which would have befitted it, he recited it with a separate stress upon each word, leaning forward, bowing his head, with at once the vehemence which a man gives, so as to be believed, to a highly improbable statement, as though the fact that he did not know the Guermantes could be due only to some strange accident of fortune, and with the emphasis of a man who, finding himself unable to keep silence about what is to him a painful situation, chooses to proclaim it aloud, so as to convince his hearers that the confession he is making is one that causes him no embarrassment, but is easy, agreeable, spontaneous, that the situation in question, in this case, the absence of relations with the Guermantes family, might very well have been not forced upon, but actually designed by Legrandin himself, might arise from some family tradition, some moral principle or mystical vow, which expressly forbade his seeking their society. "No," he resumed, explaining by his words the tone in which they were uttered, "no, I do not know them. I have never wished to know them. I have always made a point of preserving complete independence. At heart, as you know, I am a bit of a radical. People are always coming to me about it, telling me I am mistaken in not going to Guermantes, that I make myself seem ill-bred, uncivilized, an old bear. But that's not the sort of reputation that can frighten me. It's too true. In my heart of hearts I care for nothing in the world now but a few churches, books, two or three pictures, rather more perhaps, and the light of the moon when the fresh breeze of youth, such as yours, wafts to my nostrils the scent of gardens whose flowers my old eyes are not sharp enough now to distinguish." End of Part 2, Section 11.